Hello, welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce this week's Fellows Public Talk. Our speaker today is Professor Gayle, a journalist who has done some of his finest professional work on race and identity. Caleb's association with the Harvard Radcliffe Institute predates his time at the fellowship. This is thanks to an expansive research project he conducted through the Schlesinger Archive while a master's student at the Harvard Business School and Harvard Kennedy School. This project was the foundation for his first book, published this past June, entitled We Refuse to Forget, A True Story of Black Creeks, American Identity and Power. It chronicles the Creek Nation's contested history of tribal citizenship for Black members. His current project centers the personal part of his own history. Having grown up in, earned his undergraduate degree in, and written several articles set in Oklahoma, Caleb plans to complete a book about Edward McCabe, the politician who sought to settle Oklahoma as an all-Black state. At this time, the book is tentatively titled Push Ahead, but given that his previous book had at least 4 tentative titles, that may yet change. Beyond his writing, Caleb is a dog dad, forced dog dad, that is, primarily because he is a fool for love. His wife always wanted one. So you may or may not see Caleb chasing a tiny golden doodle down the streets of Cambridge begrudgingly. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to this year's Walter Jackson Bade Fellow, Caleb Gayle.
Well, thank you, Claudia. I appreciate everyone online and in person for joining me. This title has changed several times already. It is no longer Push Ahead. I don't know what the eventual title will be. I did not name the ultimate title. I've given my wife naming rights to our eventual children because I don't know how to name things. It's a fault of mine. This title of this presentation has changed several times. I'm sorry, Jen, and it will change several times again. So there are a variety of ways I can start this presentation, but perhaps I'm going to start with a parable from my grandfather. Now, as those of you who are in the room remember, I told you that I'm the son and the grandson of preachers. And my grandfather, I guess once you reach a certain age in your life, you can kind of tell stories that kind of lose their meaning half the way through, but no one can say anything because you're the elder in the room. Are you familiar? Yes? Wonderful. So forgive me if this one seems like it's losing its meaning, but it pertains exactly to what we're going to talk about. So my grandfather has a tendency, or had a tendency when he was with us, to tell us a story of a young preacher man who was incredibly excited to preach, but never really had any of the training, the requisite skills, the experience. He didn't look like a preacher. His voice didn't bellow. There was nothing about him that sounded preacherish. But he had all of the desire and the confidence he thought to preach. And so he sat on the front rows of churches waiting for ministers to kind of, what we would say in the Black church, break bread, which only meant that they would preach really well. And he could get even the most stone-faced, uninterested, recalcitrant, backsliding people to shout hallelujah. He would watch those preachers. And he would wait on bated breath that these men and these women would get people to shout hallelujah who otherwise would come into church drunk or come in stoned or what have you. That's the sort of preacher he aspired to be. But again, as I mentioned, he lacked all of the requisite skills. He knew nothing of what it meant to structure an argument, how to craft the homiletic argument such that people would feel something deeper in their bones that would get them to rise and organize to shout again, amen. But one day, after many sermons, after watching all of these people do that, the pastor of that church then looked at that man and said, "Son, it's your turn," right? The guy leaps with joy because he gets his chance. So he studies furiously. Doesn't really know how to study. He didn't go to divinity school. He didn't go to seminary. He didn't study religion over here at Harvard. He didn't know any of the words. He knew like God, right? Like he knew that word. He knew how to scream like God, right? He knew how to say those sorts of things, but he didn't know anything else. But he studied all week. He had a week to prepare. And Sunday came and he got the opportunity to sit on the rostrum, as we would call it. I still don't even know what a rostrum is, but I assume it's a stage, as my grandfather would say. And the man would sit right there on the rostrum. And when he sat on the rostrum, it came time after the choir had sung who knows how many songs for him to deliver the homiletic moment, the sermonic tone for the evening. Because black churches have a tendency of maybe starting at one point but ending at a far later time than you might have expected. So he came up there confident, his eyes gleaming, excitement kind of shining off of him, his chest kind of bursting with excitement, pride steaming off of him. And as he approaches the microphone, he leans in and absolutely nothing comes out. Eventually, his chin falls to his chest. His eyes begin to well up with tears, and he runs off the stage. And then my grandfather stops kind of telling the story and begins to narrate directly to his audience, usually his congregation in the storefront church of the Bronx, New York. And he would look at us and say, in his very much Jamaican accent, which I will not mimic for you today, had he gone up the way he came down, he would have gone down the way he came up, which was to say essentially that pride cometh before a fall, or rather he could have been the hero of this moment had he come up more humble. And perhaps we might be able to apply that very same tale to this man named Edward Preston McCabe. Because Edward McCabe kind of came up the way pretty much every single hero throughout kind of the lexicon of American great heroes came up. He came up cocky, even though he had none of the requisite skills or abilities. He was an attorney essentially because he was able to convince the Kansas authorities that he was of fit quality, that he was able to point to his friend who was his partner, a guy named Abram T. Hall, and he was able to say, look, this is my friend who speaks French and Latin. Yes, we're both black, but we speak French and Latin. And so he came up there with the excitement that he wanted to lead, though he had none of the requisite skills. But for most, when we would look at the kind of winning and losing record of Edward McCabe, we have to ask ourselves, did he actually go down humble? Did his head hang low? Did his eyes well up with tears? Because his notion was that if perhaps this territory that was allocated for those who had been forcibly removed from the Southeast and forced to go west could then become that much blacker, could perhaps home for black people in America be found. That is where we find my story. So, with that parable that seemed like it was going to lose us and veer us completely off track, that's where we find my work beginning, is in figuring out, is Edward McCabe perhaps the loser that we think that he is because he didn't get what he wanted, a blacker America, crafted upon the backs of those, in the spaces of those who had been forced to be there, in the direct collisions with those who also saw openings of land in a place called Indian Territory, soon to become Oklahoma. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna walk us through a few slides. I feel very much like the management consultant that I once was as I was making these slides yet again. It's okay for you to laugh. It's okay for you guys to talk back. It's okay for you to smile. As I mentioned, I do come from the black church, so you can have expressions and emotions when listening or talking to the person who's speaking. So I think for most of you who have ever heard of Oklahoma, this might be the sum total of your knowledge with the place, right? Last year was probably the first year that I was made aware that anyone outside of Oklahoma, anyone outside of Tulsa for that matter, that was not an academic, who did not study African American history, that had no ties to Oklahoma, had any knowledge of what Black Wall Street once was, or that the destruction that kind of tore it apart. I had no idea that most people, I didn't know that it would ever catch fire. And these are two of the survivors, the living survivors still today, along with Hugh Van Ellis, not pictured here, who are still kind of fighting for some level of remuneration, some reparations for what they and so many others in that community endured. But what was so much less known about this area called Black Wall Street, which we'll talk about very briefly for those who are unaware, this Greenwood area, but it was just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger struggle, right? It, in fact, was kind of the outcome, the output, if you will, of a much larger struggle, which we'll talk about. But let's give you a little bit more of the familiar that you might have become acquainted with either through television shows or kind of the wall-to-wall coverage that we got in Tulsa for 48 hours, which is probably more coverage than Tulsa has gotten ever, perhaps. How many of you in this room, I know that for the Zoom audience it probably doesn't matter, but how many of you in this room actually had heard of Black Wall Street and what happened there before last year? It's okay if you didn't. Cool, that's much larger than I expected. So, for those of you who did not, in 1921, a simple tripping incident between a guy named Dick Rowland, who was entering the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa, between him and a lady named Sarah Page, 17 years old, who was white, escalated in the eyes of those who were around into an act of aggression made by a black man against a innocent white woman. Of course, Sarah Page denied that anything bad happened. Dick Rowland was arrested. It kind of kick-started a series of issues that were already latent. It was the match that lit a bomb, essentially, if you will. And this kind of became the pretext for thousands of white Tulsans to set upon Black Wall Street, right? And Black Wall Street at that time was home to hundreds of black-owned homes, stores, doctors' offices, churches, schools, and many of them were burned. Hundreds of people that we know of were killed. We're still searching for the bodies to this day. We're still looking for where they are. We don't actually know just how many people were killed. I don't mean to start on such a painful note, but it's the note that's most accurate. And perhaps most chillingly, for those of you who did not know this story, I'm gonna make you feel just a tad bit better. You could live your entire life there in Tulsa, attending its schools, going to its churches, playing sports on its fields, without ever having known that anything like that happened. And if you don't believe me, you're looking at someone who did, right? I grew up there without any understanding that anything happened there. People who were descendants of people who survived and died as a result of what happened at Black Wall Street had no clue about what happened there. A lot of my journalistic pursuits have focused on the descendants of people who had not the faintest clue. And yes, shows like Lovecraft Country and Watchmen. How many of you saw any of these shows? Hands, please. Wonderful. Yeah, so Hollywood has kind of helped to mainstream some of these histories, right? And it's all well and good, right? And I'm glad that some of these shows have helped with that. And of course, you know, are there elements of it that are all the way true? No, but it at least gets into the conversation a portion of American history that otherwise none of us would know, right? And for a lot of Tulsans, it was a gripping moment for us to see the place where our baseball stadium is, that has provided millions of revenue dollars to the city that have not touched yet one black soul, have not found their ways into one black pocket, sitting still, situated in the very places where Black Wall Street once stood tall, right? So we're glad about these things, but Oklahoma's history just, especially its black story, just didn't begin or end there, right? In fact, I would argue that the story of Oklahoma is really the project of beginning again. Now, for context, I am deep in the process of writing and researching this book. If you're trying to read that, don't worry. You won't be able to. Those of you on Zoom, you won't be able to. I'll explain what you see on the screen behind you, or for those of you who are watching on Zoom, I'll explain what you see on the screen in just 1 second. But the entire concept of Oklahoma, to some great extent, has been the project of renewing, the project of trying to scaffold enough of policies, legislation, enough culture, enough artifacts, enough of something to begin once again. Oftentimes, that beginning again was forced upon people. In some instances, that beginning again was by choice. And its project is problematic to its core. And we're going to explore a little bit of that. So I wish we were all in the same room, because I feel like I'm back in class. And I have like the temptation to be like, does anyone know what these pictures are from, right? That typical thing. But I'm in a room full of people, many of whom are in fact people who teach in a classroom. Does anyone know where this is from? Any of these pictures? People on Zoom could be hitting it up on Slido. Anyone want to take a guess? I'll wait, because I have time. I'm looking at the clock. I know I have time. Anyone want to take a guess?
Looks like a trial.
A trial? Leah?
Is it the National Color Convention?
Someone can read really well. That prescription is phenomenal. Yes, right? It is, right? So there's a whole body of work, right? Part of which was, in a collection edited by kind of one of the patron saints, in my opinion, of Black Tulsa, John Hope Franklin, whose father was a guy named B.C. Franklin, who defended Tulsa's black community at the kind of apex of its pain immediately following the Tulsa Race Massacre, as black citizens were barred by city edict from rebuilding the city. But at any rate, part of what he did was collect these manuscripts, the proceedings, the agendas from these proceedings of national and local and statewide conventions of colored men. And of course, there have been plenty of additional works that have been done to demonstrate that it wasn't just strictly men sitting in a room hashing it out, but there were plenty of also conversations that were happening with women as well. But the question was, for a while, right, was, how are we going to identify rights? There were whispers, and I'm, of course, for those of you who are historians in the room or on Zoom, I am glossing over like such meticulously researched stuff. And so if you have questions that are more detailed, or if I'm saying something that is perhaps just close enough to being right but not perfectly right, save it. But, right, there is something quite beautiful about what was happening, was that on the margins, as someone like Jesse Lehman would say, there was a certain level of abundance. There was a certain level of living abundantly, where in these conversations they were exploring, yet and still, how can we begin again in a place that really has not necessarily accommodated us? Even before, right, the Civil War had reached its end, even before the Civil War had even started, these conventions were taking place. And there was one in particular that I found really interesting in some of the earliest portions of my research. So this one's from Parsons in 1882. But I found one initially in 1866. So the one in 1866, which is even more illegible than the thing you see right here. Thank God for archivists and librarians, first of all, okay? But the one that's even more illegible from 1866, the questions are really interesting. It was in Lawrence, Kansas. This one's in Parsons, Kansas, at the Edwards Opera House. So let's start first with the one in 1866, right? So we're a couple of years after the Civil War, and there are some critical questions that are being asked, right? Why is it that black people are not mentioned explicitly in this initial draft of our state constitution? Why are we not even named as potentially being able to be conscripted into our state militia? Why are we not counted amongst equals here? Like, why is it that we are not considered on par? Why they're asking these questions, why? And then they're adding on top of that all these recommendations as to what can be then done as a result of these questions that are mainly rhetorical, to like figure out how can we create, again, another opportunity for us to ask again, how can we begin again in a way that's a bit more equitable, right? So then, in 1882, I noticed something very strange afoot. And it seems as if we're not talking about Edward McCabe, but rather we're talking about what led to Edward McCabe emerging as he did, right? So in 1882, 16 years later, the tone is completely different. They are no longer asking questions like, how can we fit in? I'm, of course, whittling it down, but how can we be considered, equal amongst our peers? How can we be considered one with our white brethren? How can we be considered, equal? How can we be treated equally under the law? No, in fact, the questions change. In fact, there are very few questions being asked during this Parsons Convention at all. It's a series of statements, a series of plans. In fact, they actively are talking about the hatching of plans. They're referencing the Oklahoma Immigration Association based in Topeka, where we're saying, screw it, right? We're done. We're done. I was about to curse because that's just kind of how excited I get talking about the hatching of plans. But they were done. They were through. And they decided that instead of lingering and trying to figure out a way to convince and persuade their white brothers and sisters to see them equally, that they might chart a course to go south to Indian Territory. And we're going to talk about why here in a second that was a flawed plan. I keep hitting the mic. I apologize for that. But we'll talk about why that was a flawed plan, but the tone shift is important. They all of a sudden started talking about how Oklahoma clubs have been formed across different states. People had been setting flyers to different parts of different states, advertising just how much excitement existed in Oklahoma, that there are people who had already sought opportunities in Oklahoma and already had prospered. They started to reference people who were black, but also citizens of various nations, like the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and the prosperity that they had already achieved there. So the imagination had become more expansive, far more expansive than it once was. And so the questions they were asking had been abandoned, and the recommendations had become rather specific. Okay. So the beginning again for a lot of black people began in Nicodemus, Kansas. Began really all over Kansas, right? And it was enabled by homesteading, which we're not going to talk about in detail, and the speculating process, which we're not going to talk about in detail. But the town of Nicodemus in particular was founded by 5 black men and 1 white guy. The one black guy who was actually able to sign his name was only able to sign his name because he was the one person who could read. And we knew that because he was the guy whose eye was gouged out because he was a former slave who learned how to read. And of course, something about black people learning how to read was a dangerous and precarious affair. Anyways, it was an assemblage of dugouts, oftentimes oversold to people in places like Mississippi and Kentucky and Tennessee as a much more grand opportunity. But its fundament grew, and its recognition as an essential kind of power base of kind of black power, not just here, but in Votau County or Graham County and other parts of Kansas kind of grew. They became kind of these essential points of political power because in Kansas, they saw Kansas because of the legacy of people like John Brown. They saw it as a lot of white politicians recognized that these towns were critical. And so these were some of those on Zoom, I'm gonna do what Jen told me, and instead of using this laser pointer in my hand, I'm gonna use the one on Zoom. But these sort of advertisements were going around. We don't even know if they actually assessed whether or not it was the largest colony, but people like Benjamin Pap Singleton, who we'll meet in a second, they were sending out these advertisements. It's the best place to live, largest colony in America. Are you poor and desperate? Do you just need $5 and the willingness to work? Just come on out here, right? Ho for Kansas, go to Kansas. Kansas is the best place in the world. Come on out to Kansas. That's what the advertisement was initially. And the person who took great advantage of this was not a former slave. A lot of the people who were moving over called exodusters. They were incredibly excited, making this mass exodus. There was something called the Kansas Freedmen Relief Association, founded by Governor John Pierce St. John, a white Quaker governor who was incredibly excited to have tons initially, a good number of black people settling the area, industrious black people, investing in an industrial institute to train former slaves on how to become, productive members of society, gifting them with, the skills and know-how, gifts of money and opportunity, the leg up that they needed, very familiar tones that are struck with philanthropy and black people today, which is a conversation I'd love to have later as someone who used to work in philanthropy. But that's how Nicodemus grew. But there were people who found the opportunity set in Nicodemus quite appealing, who had no ties to slavery whatsoever, and people like Edward McCabe. It took a while, right? The wind-up took a while. But now we're here at Edward McCabe. And Edward McCabe was first born in New York, and he traveled around a lot. Went to a nice boarding school in Newport, Rhode Island, so not far from here. Then he finally went to New York again, became a clerk on Wall Street, pretty young in his life as a pretty indistinguishably non-passing black guy. Went to Chicago and advised people like Potter Palmer on the development of State Street, known as like at the Hotel King of State Street. But in Chicago, he became acquainted with a guy named A.T. Hall Jr., Abram T. Hall, who came from like a long line of unenslaved black folk who also were very big in what's called the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a very dominant and prestigious predominantly black denomination founded here in the United States. And so those two teamed up. Abram T. Hall, who was, did some time in medical training, learned French, taught himself Latin, was kind of a well-learned journalist who had written quite extensively, and they thought to themselves, perhaps we cannot get up from under the thumb of white America unless we find for ourselves an opportunity elsewhere. And so that's why they hatched a plan to go to Nicodemus. And so there are a lot of correspondence between the two of them. What's great about, from my research at least, is that these men were invested heavily as newspapermen, right? Like they were invested heavily in trying not only to get out their general thoughts about politics at the time, but also really heavily invested with promoting not only the area they were going to, but especially in McCabe's case, very invested in promoting themselves. To our point earlier about kind of going up the way you came down from my grandfather's parable. But McCabe was enabled not just by all the work that happened before him, but there were certain contemporary actors that were pretty critical, right? So we've already talked, to get out the laser pointer for the folks on Zoom, we've already talked a bit about this guy over here, Governor John Pierce St. John, who developed a strong affinity for people like Abram T. Hall and Edward McCabe. By the time Edward McCabe and Abram T. Hall and Edward McCabe got to Nicodemus, they quickly became the people who incorporated Nicodemus. They found themselves becoming quickly as lawyers and land agents. They became quite astute and well off. And not only become well off, they essentially started to own and lease much of the land in Nicodemus and the surrounding counties. And so as such, they were bringing in black people in droves, at a much larger rate than anyone had ever expected. And pretty quickly, people like Edward McCabe were able to position themselves for office at a much higher level than we initially thought, right? So instead of just becoming the head of a county or the treasurer for a district or a precinct, this man was the first black man to become elected to a statewide position in the Old West. He became the state auditor. Now, there's some interesting research on whether or not people actually knew that Edward McCabe was black. Because all of this, especially all of this, was happening as Reconstruction was kind of fading away from existence, fading away from the hopes of Reconstruction were kind of fading in front of their eyes. And so as such, the kind of mystery of McCabe is how he was able to kind of achieve just what he achieved at the precise time that the hopes of Black America, especially in the South, were fading. So St. John, this governor, kind of opened the floodgates to Kansas, established the Kansas Freedmen Relief Association. But what became, and wrote pretty extensively later on, that he became overrun. He never expected that many black people to show up. He felt as if he became not just overrun, but overextended the state's resources. The state pulled back a lot of its resources, and so as such, people like Elizabeth Comstock, a fellow Quaker, moved, along with people like Laura Haviland and a host of others, their way into places like Kansas, bought up land, bequeathed it to a lot of black people, and then also started to kind of engage in philanthropic acts, began to engage in policy and legislative actions, began to organize for people like Abram T. Hall and Edward McCabe. And so when we examine kind of the lives, or when we try and explain the histories of certain people and the way in which they actually emerged, we actually end up explaining a lot of other political actors who emerged at the same time. And of course, Benjamin Pap Singleton, who was probably the biggest booster of Kansas at that time, a former slave who escaped from slavery to Canada and then came back and said, oh no, there's opportunity in Kansas, right? So all of these actors, plus many, many more, are very much involved in kind of the propulsion of Edward McCabe as kind of its emergent political figure. So we're almost done, because one other consideration to make. So is anyone familiar? I mean, we do. I'm not going to do that. We know who these people are because we see them on the screen. So the first guy up top is probably one of the most detestable figures ever. I'm going to lead into that. His name is Henry Dawes, and the second guy is named Senator Charles Curtis, right? So part of what enabled Edward McCabe's kind of emergent, somewhat quixotic effort to not only emerge as kind of a venerable leader of Kansas, but his desire to then do what was even more problematic and colonize Indian territory for black people. Part of what enabled that group in Parsons, Kansas, that convention of colored men, to then try to think to themselves, it's our opportunity to abandon Kansas and our hopes here, and instead to try and identify Indian territory with these Oklahoma clubs, to create an Oklahoma Immigration Association and start flooding the zone in Oklahoma, was because of these two men. And of course, there are a host of other actors, but these two men in particular, Henry Dawes, the Dawes Act, 1887, if we're not familiar, essentially, just to kind of zip past a lot of history, made it the business of the United States government to identify who was authentically parts of which nations in Oklahoma, specifically what we would then call the so-called 5 civilized tribes, right? Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, right? And in so doing, as indelicate as that process was, as inappropriate as that process was, as absolutely racist and anti-indigenous as that process was, it also enabled the US government to reduce the size of the land holdings of those 5 nations, along with many more, by at least 90 million acres that we know of. At the outset, there were many more. So of course, what that did was, that enabled the US government to force the forfeiture of 90 million acres of land. So of course, the folks who were in Kansas, of course the black people, especially like Edward McCabe, after he lost his next election and was despondent about the likelihood of perhaps never kind of emerging as a true kind of independent black man, thought to himself, well, let me dart off for the place that's just been opened up just beyond the reaches fully of what the US government can control, because technically it's a territory, and technically it was at that point that the US government was trying to figure out, of course, I'm glossing over a lot of history here, it was at that precise point the US government was trying to figure out, well, in what form shall we admit this territory as a state, right? So McCabe wasn't alone, right? As I mentioned, that opportunity for expansion was significant. And so the project of beginning again wasn't just in the lap of black people, it was also in the lap of these nations, who also, some of them began to form efforts to try and recreate what was then Indian territory into Sequoia, which would then sit as a state amongst the other states at that time and would lobby for its own efforts like any other state, which would self-govern like any other state. But at the same time, you have someone like Edward McCabe who was trying to do the same, and you had the United States government who was also contemplating the creation of its own state. So it was the ultimate collision of the disinherited, because the people who were coming to Oklahoma, rather Indian Territory at that time, a lot of them were poor folks. So when you read people like Chief Mays, or when you read people like Alex Posey, when you read a lot of black citizens of these nations, they would refer to what we would now call boomers or Sooners, these white people who were extra excited, the people who my undergraduate institution has made their mascot, right? The Boomer Sooner, familiar, anybody? We yell Boomer Sooner at University of Oklahoma. I don't anymore, but like that's what we yell. We valorize those folks. What they were doing, when you would read these folks' writings, they would call them what we call a bunch of people who aren't that. We call them illegal immigrants. That's what they called them back then, because these folks were just trampling over land, trying to actively get their opportunity at the land that was being opened up. So what was happening was that Edward McCabe was inserting himself at the precise time that plenty of other people were trying to, in the case of many of those nations, figure out how are we going to reorganize in a way that positions us to kind of stand against the encroachment of the United States. A bunch of poor whites usually, as well as wealthy whites, who were looking at opportunities they couldn't get elsewhere, and a bunch of black people who were also thinking to themselves, where else are we going to go? Because all three of those groups were being forced to ask yet again, how do we begin again? So, as a very clear kind of distinction of this, so if we look here first, Edward McCabe, as I mentioned, was a newspaper man, venerable one. By that I mean, he pretty much made a newspaper with his best boy, his guy, his boy, all right. Anyways, he decided he was going to create a newspaper when he moved to Oklahoma to a place he named on his own called Langston, named after John Mercer Langston, a famous Reconstruction era politician. And he was going to advertise it. So he built this newspaper explicitly to tell the tale of Oklahoma as a prosperous opportunity for a ton of black people, right? And he called it Langston City. And if you look at the column right next to this lot planning, so whenever you look at old school plot lands or land plans, it essentially has these demarcations of who owns what lots, usually separated by anywhere from 40 to 160 acres, sometimes more, sometimes 340 acres, depending upon where you are. But if you look very carefully here at this, freedom, peace, happiness, prosperity, do you want all of these? And then later on in the article, it explicitly states, they've opened up the Cherokee Strip, right? A particular, very large part of the Cherokee Nation's holdings, right? But then when we go over to the next slide, right? War in the territory. Negroes fortified against the Cherokees. The Cherokees give the squatters on their lands notice to vacate, but the squatters prepare to fight instead. Chief Mays was one of the people that I just referenced earlier who was involved in that, right? We foisted upon people a collision that never had to exist. And so there are a ton of these sorts of collisions. There are a ton of these sorts of antipathies that are still with some of us today. Still with some of us today in Oklahoma. Still with us today in different parts of the country that I want to make sure to tease out very carefully in the book. So here, this is another article that kind of demonstrates what then McCabe encountered, right? So McCabe, who by this point is now deputy auditor for Indian Territory, where they've now become dubbed as Oklahoma Territory, this white newspaper says, look, it's as free as air, right? Opening of the Indian lands to settlers, a wild rush of all classes of people to get the coveted areas, right? It was like, who's gonna get there first, right? A foot race. Then, in this portion, we see what happens to McCabe, who was trying to do the same. But notice who met him there. So when ex-auditor McCabe of Kansas, the founder of the Negro colony at Langston, started for Guthrie through Iowa lands, he was met by 3 men who ordered him to go back. When he came, he declined, and they opened fire on him. They shot his horse. These were, we end up finding out later through subsequent newspapers, these were some white boomers, right, who were pissed off that he was coming into land that he had theoretically, not even theoretically, truly acquired through legal means. And they had said, darn, like, this land is just not gonna be your land anymore. So now we're gonna take these guns and demonstrate to you just how much we mean that this land is not your land. And Edward McCabe, while he might have been one example, there are plenty more other people who also encountered this. This is Oklahoma, because Oklahoma, the formation of it, just to kind of really lean into it a little bit more, right, was the imminent expression of white supremacy, just put a finer point on it, right? Because it was, and to me, as an Oklahoman still is, right, these sorts of collisions became inevitable, and they became more numerous, right, period. So the reality that McCabe wanted just wasn't the case, right? His dreams became outmoded by a reality that was just so much harder. So what you're seeing here on your right was a state that was not interested in letting people begin again. They had a very clear idea, and it was to flatten identities, right? Expand the notion of what it meant to be a white person, a pioneer, someone who was brave, who forged a new state, who stepped out into Indian Territory and saw that it was nothing, that its people were, in some of the words of some of the founding members of what we now call Oklahoma, untamed, right? And their first law that they decided to pass, out of the many things that they needed to pass, imagine if the land and its people, quote unquote, were so untamed, imagine what your first law would have been. I mean, there are a lot. The first law they passed was this train car law, right? Which was as Jim Crow could get. Essentially, you were black, you're found in the same car, you're getting fined. Perhaps worse, right? That was the first law, and it extended segregation throughout the state, right? So the promises of McCabe, this is the precise time that McCabe leaves. He gives up. He goes back to DC for a while and eventually goes back to Chicago, right? And this is kind of where his story, to some extent, kind of fades into non-existence, to some extent. But in my work so far, it's not clear that his legacy also kind of fades away into existence, right? So Indian Territory had become Eden. This was the phrase for so many people. If you've read Paradise by Toni Morrison, if you've read love songs of W.B. Du Bois by Honoré Jeffers, if you've taken the time to even read some of the early reports of people like Carol Wright, statistician who helped to kind of develop the Labor Department's Bureau of Statistics when he came to do some of the initial censuses the eastern portion of Oklahoma, they would say, like, this might be the best hope for the Negro, period. The reason they said that is because of things like this advertisement that was sent out long after McCabe had kind of taken leave from Oklahoma, where they said, here's a message to the colored man, do you want a home in the great Southwest? The beautiful Indian Territory in a town populated by intelligent, self-reliant colored people. Notice their decision to not use the word Oklahoma, where all lines of business, professions, and your local government will be in your own hands, where your chance for development and growth financially, politically, socially, intellectually will be limited only by your own ability. So in the face of what was clearly a separate but equal consideration of their black lives, they took it as an opportunity, though they existed on the margins, to choose a particular path of abundance. And so part of what re-examining McCabe's kind of true history and impact is examining whether or not his legacy kind of existed far beyond his hopes of emerging not only as the founder of an all-black state, but his decision to be the governor of it. So I asked myself, not even asked myself, it seems as if to me, losers just don't get obituaries, right? And so if you go looking for like obituaries of Edward McCabe, they're about 3 or 4 lines long. You know, he died, survived by his wife, next, right? Or former ex-auditor McCabe, dead, right? That's about it, right? But in my opinion, these grand obituaries, he's deserving of one, in part because he did lose. And examining why he lost his efforts to make that black state, why his aims for wanting a black state are so deeply problematic, and even more so, what legacy he then left. So for me, growing up in Oklahoma, I can recall going to the Boley Black Rodeo. I had no idea that there were tons of black towns. There were 50 of them that emerged as a result, right? 50. 13 still remain. I can remember going to, let's see if I can do this again, Taft, where the first black female mayor in the United States of America was elected, Layla Ford. I distinctly remember, I kid you not, in a car, black guy, might have had an affiliation with a particular extracurricular group that you might hear in some hip hop lyrics, wearing said colors, shirtless, going to the grocery store in Taft, me in the car, him on a horse. Wild. Or if you go to North Tulsa, where Greenwood is, but you go just slightly north into Turley, right? Same thing, where the it's not so much frozen in time. There's an honor of whence they came, right? In a way that I still, admittedly, even though I've written a lot about it, I find myself still struggling to fully encapsulate, right? And so that's admittedly, since we're talking about where we are in the process, that's a part of me, that's part of where I am. It's part of where I think, as I've told many of you in the room, you've seen me like looking somewhat bleary-eyed, is because I've been on these 5-hour oral history interviews with folks because I need that, right? And so to kind of spare you, part of what I've done so far is kind of examining these, real estate records and town charters. There are thousands of these, right? Because these guys were actively doing land deals in Kansas and Oklahoma. There are advertisements and letters sent to all manner of people, from presidents to vice presidents to secretaries of state to you name it. There are newspapers and magazines that these folks started that even sometimes when they're not necessarily putting themselves on the byline that they own those newspapers, there's almost nothing that I can kind of leave, there's no stone I can be left unturned. There are policy documents and proceedings. There are, town council minutes that they meticulously kept. So part of the reason that I'm telling this story, to kind of conclude, is because I think that the Pyrrhic ambitions and whatever victories associated with McCabe kind of resituates how we remember Black life in America. I think usually, at least I grew up with a much more linear and less complicated view of what life for those who were not white, specifically not white straight men, looked like in America. It almost seemed as if the folks who deserved beautiful sentences, beautiful renderings, beautiful and complicated and difficult biographies were those who didn't look like me. Those who were allowed to have heroes had to be perfect. And McCabe was someone who was far from perfect. He was the guy to end where my grandfather ended. He was the guy who came up as he should have gone down. And so that's where I'm going to stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Caleb.
Anytime.
Wonderful talk.
You betcha.
I guess the first question is just following up on one of your last points.
Sure.
Can you say more about how Black people colonizing Oklahoma has influenced present-day racial tensions between Black folks and Native Americans?
Sure. Well, that's a loaded question. How much time you got?
10 minutes.
Yeah, we'll keep it really short. You know, I think that question, to some extent, kind of leaves out this really rich and beautiful history of, let's step back. I think it's really important to first state that those nations are, in fact, nations. And so they have and should have their own ways of determining citizenship. Whether or not we understand them, whether or not we appreciate them is really not much of our business to have. And so I guess, you know, it's harder for me to opine on that one. I will say that, like, I think that it's gonna sound really rude, but I just think that, like, had perhaps, like, colonizers not been so dang involved, it wouldn't have interrupted the curious and kind of beautifully complex ways in which a lot of these nations had figured out how to incorporate some Black people who they had held as slaves, some people that they had never held as slaves, some people that they had adopted, some people they had created very unique pathways to citizenship for. So I don't know if I can answer that question as easily. I do think that within kind of the broader mainstream context of that which is Oklahoma, it's sad that, you know, that those histories are just so, they're just so far from view. It's just so far from view. I don't even know how to put it. It's not present whatsoever. Sorry, I wish I could give you a better answer whoever asked that question, but it is what it is.
Of the remaining all Black towns in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
how well are they doing in 2022?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of them don't necessarily have massive commercial bases. I know that one state senator there named Kevin Matthews is really trying to consider how perhaps there's a tourist-based kind of economic approach that can be used to both revitalize and sustain them. Because when I was growing up, I remember going on the Blacktown tourist visit experience, which a lot of towns around the country have used that are even not even Black towns, but there's, like, you get to those towns and sometimes they don't even have a gift shop, or there aren't the sort of things necessary, there aren't the sort of fixtures necessary to kind of enable that. And so I know that he's been spending a lot of time on that, but I think more can be done. I think also because so much of it is relatively inaccessible, because Oklahoma doesn't necessarily have a plethora of direct flights, it's harder for people to access. So I think thinking about what are some of the virtual ways in which people can access that knowledge is going to be really important. And then, you know, Emmanuel Felton from the Washington Post did a phenomenal feature story about the people there who were trying to kind of resurrect it. trying to kind of create, kind of a blend of entrepreneurial and educational approaches to giving people the restorative opportunities there on their own terms that I think could be quite, radical, but also interesting.
And the next question is, why do you think this history is largely unknown to Oklahomans?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that these histories are dangerous for a lot of kind of time-honored traditions in Oklahoma. I think it just paints Oklahoma in a light that's just not all that pretty. Let's just start with my university, University of Oklahoma, right? And I remember my first game that I went to, University of Oklahoma, and there is a covered wagon that encircles like the fields, and I didn't know what the heck was going on, and people are screaming "Boomer Sooner," and I don't think you would. Would you like to tell the 60,000 fans, Claudia, that this is what's happening there? There are people who do, but I think it's a lot easier to be the person who goes along with said trends. I'll give you another example really quickly. It was in 2017, I believe, when Oklahoma City Public Schools stopped a tradition that I remember doing when we first moved to Oklahoma. So for clarity, my family's very Jamaican. And so when we got to Oklahoma, I had no idea about its history. I distinctly remember it was like 4th grade or 5th grade or something like that. We all got these really nice, fancy red wagons. The red flyers, what are they called? You know what I'm talking about? The red flyers, the fancy ones. We got like shovels, and it was like a geometry/history exercise, and there was a massive field outside of my school, and we all lined up, and the teachers had us run into that field. This is jarring. And we had to essentially prospect the land, then take it, like the people who came into Indian Territory did. And that was a tradition that was carried on until 2017 in Oklahoma City. I mean, how bizarre and screwed up is that? So I think it's so in the notions of pioneering attitudes that valorize white people conquesting and colonizing people who didn't ask for their help, didn't ask for their intrusions, is so embedded into the fundament that is Oklahoma that it's so difficult to unearth. I mean, the fact that we didn't even know that Black Wall Street was burned asunder is just another example of that, right? It's just, I don't know. And then on top of that, we've had a governor who, though he himself claims to be a member of the Cherokee Nation, is actively trying to undo any sort of education on any of those topics with his recent foray into banning CRT in our curriculum, and is actively trying to disqualify certain districts from doing their job, decertify them because of it. So I just think it's a moment in which you think back to that poetic phrase that says, "God, your ocean is so large, but my boat is so small." That's why people don't know about the history. Optimistic tone.
Thank you. This is all we have time today. I want to thank the audience here in the room with me and online. Thank you for your terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe events. You can find more about what's on offer at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for being with us today. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.